Mason Taylor talked about what he went through during the recruiting. He said about 20 schools reached out to him. Florida was one that he was really interested in because he wanted to stay where he was from. And also, there was some interest coming from Alabama. But in the end, even though Nick Saban was good friends with Jason Taylor because Saban had actually coached Jason Taylor for a little bit when Saban was the head coach at Miami, they didn't really put on a full court press. Neither did Florida. The team that was really the most interested was LSU. And so they wind up landing him. Mason Taylor said that his father had said, go to a major school at a major program in a major conference. He had decided he wanted to go to an SEC team. And so LSU made the most sense considering how strong they were in their recruiting pitch. Talk to me a little bit about what the recruiting was like back then, because we'll get into the changes that happened. But Ed Ogeron was the head coach at the time, and there had been a national championship won under his watch.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at Mason Taylor's recruiting process, it's obviously a little bit of a unique one. Getting recruited and kind of wined and dined by Ed Orgeron. For the most part, really started to develop a relationship there on that front and develop some rapport. And then obviously Orgeron and LSU part ways, and in comes Brian Kelly. And this was a time where it was hold on to your crown jewels, hold on to the guys that you really believe can be difference makers. And it started with guys like Mason Taylor, Will Campbell, get Emory Jones in the mix, etc. So Brian Kelly and the staff that he put together in a short period of time really started to buckle down on guys like Mason Taylor. And nonetheless, to hold on to him is big time, especially, when Nick Saban was sitting back saying, once he committed to LSU, that was when they started to put that full court press. They were kind of recruiting him lightly, and then he committed to LSU and started to realize, okay, maybe this guy is the real deal. So come in, Brian Kelly, depart Ed Orgeron, and Nick Saban has a chance to get him and ultimately can't. So Brian Kelly really locked in his jewel there, and Mason Taylor's panned out to be that guy for him. The recruiting process was one that treated him well, like you said, kind of a myriad of SEC schools pushing for him. LSU was the one that ultimately landed the pledge, and the rest is kind of history, man. His time at LSU has been a really, really fun one.
Let's get into what happened with Ed Orgeron because he winds up being shown the door. Brian Kelly comes in, and this is where a lot of times players would decide that they want to change their commitment because the guy that recruited them is the one that they wanted to play for. They don't want to stick around for the new coach. Mason Taylor didn't do that, though. He stuck around at LSU. What do you remember about that?
Yeah, I think it speaks to the character of Mason Taylor. I mean, you're in a spot where the team is struggling. I mean, I believe it was back-to-back 6 and 6 years under Orgeron. The team isn't necessarily a powerhouse. They're trying to kind of recalibrate after that 2019 national championship season. And you kind of stay true to your guns here in Mason Taylor. And like I said, it's a testament to the person that he is, the family that he comes from, and staying true to his commitment and staying loyal to that. And ultimately puts pen to paper with LSU and makes his way to Baton Rouge. But the recruiting process was obviously a tricky one down the stretch during that December timeframe. But staying true to his guns ultimately panned out. Considering here we are now talking about him being a second-round pick by the New York Jets and a key component to the offensive success of LSU during his time in Baton Rouge.
Zach, as we know, especially at an SEC school, but really any college football program, it's very tough for a true freshman to start right away because these rosters tend to be very stacked, especially at a place like LSU, and so you almost always have to wait your turn. That did not happen with Mason Taylor. He began as a starter right away his freshman year, and we'll get into the specifics of what happened there, but talk to me a little bit about how he went about earning that starting job. I know that he had the pedigree, I know that he had the name, but still, to be able to get in there with an old school coach like Brian Kelly, who was the guy that didn't even recruit him, so there weren't the same type of ties as there would have been to Ed Orgeron, and earn his respect and earn his trust that quickly and get right into the starting lineup, must have made a huge impression in spring ball and then obviously practice throughout the summertime.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there, Scott, when you talk about kind of the pedigree of Brian Kelly. This is a guy who is old school. This is a guy who likes to stick to the veterans and give them a chance to really continue to show out before giving an opportunity to a true freshman. So you look at a guy like Mason Taylor to sit back and earn that true freshman spot. That was not given. That was earned during that process of spring camp, summer workouts, into fall camp before his true freshman campaign. So this was earned. And to be prepared for SEC play is one that a lot of coaches do not take lightly, especially when you're kind of in the trenches there. As an offensive lineman, as a tight end, when your hand's in the dirt, it's hard to get acclimated to the physicality of SEC play. And obviously Mason Taylor put on some size, put on some weight, and was physically prepared, mentally prepared. And Brian Kelly ultimately gave him the nod to be a starter as a true freshman. And again, another thing, I'm going to say it over and over again. It's a testament to the character of Mason Taylor. He was willing to do the nitty gritty, willing to live in the weight room, willing to get kind of conditioned for the SEC. So came in, earned his spot. And for Brian Kelly to give a true freshman the nod in his first season in Baton Rouge, I think that speaks a lot to who Mason Taylor truly is, both on and off the field.
Play like a Jet. Play like a Jet.
Mason Taylor has said his freshman year he had two defining moments in his college football career, one good, one bad. The bad one came first. It was against Florida State, where he failed to get out of bounds at a crucial moment, and it may have cost LSU dearly, perhaps even the game. And so he was getting a lot of hate online. People were flooding his DMs. And as an 18-year-old kid, it freaked him out a little bit. But then, not long after that, he winds up catching the game-winning two-point conversion against Alabama, and all of a sudden he's a hero. And he said that in his DMs, a lot of the people who had been sending him DMs saying, "You suck," and all these other nasty things, would then follow it up with, "I'm sorry, I was wrong about you." So you're a bum one day, you're a hero the next. But also what he learned there was not to take what people say too seriously, because everything's going to change moment to moment. That's the way fans are. And it doesn't matter whether you try to defend yourself, because he said that was his inclination at first, because nobody's really going to understand what actually happened. They just want to be angry. So it's not worth it to pay attention to any of that. Just block it out, and you'll have more great moments like the one he had against Alabama.
Yeah, I mean, no doubt. They'll kick you when you're down, and they'll lift you up higher than you were before during those big-time moments. And that's just sports, and especially when you're not at a school like SEC, that fan base is something serious. I mean, they are probably some of the most passionate fans that I've ever come across in my lifetime. So obviously when it comes to Mason Taylor, they're going to kick you when you're down. Obviously, like in that 2022 game against Florida in the Superdome, against Florida State in the Superdome. So, you come back and you redeem yourself with one of the biggest, if not the biggest, plays of his career in Baton Rouge with that two-point conversion against Alabama to win the game. One of the most electrifying atmospheres over the last 5 years probably, and Mason Taylor was the one that got them over the hump. So just kind of staying true to your guns is important for a guy like Mason Taylor. Obviously, a true freshman in the SEC, you're going to have your learning curves. And to get that out of the way in week one and start to understand the kind of caliber program that you're dealing with, I think is super important. I think it helps with your evolution as a player. We saw him kind of get kicked, get down even more and more, and then lift yourself up against a big-time moment in Alabama. So a true kind of testament to the work ethic of his, the mental strength, the ability to block out the noise. I think Mason Taylor had his learning curve, his hiccup early, and it kind of allowed him to redeem himself in year one and carry that momentum into the rest of his time in Baton Rouge.
Zach, tell me a little bit more about the rest of his freshman season, because we hit on those two notes, the high note, the low note. What else happened the rest of the year? Because he had a pretty respectable season for a true freshman, 38 catches, 414 yards, and 3 touchdowns, which, funny enough, wound up being the most touchdowns that he would score in a season at LSU.
Yeah, he became a really solid safety net for Jaden Daniels, and it was a season where Jaden wasn't necessarily pushing the ball down the field to a certain degree, wasn't necessarily trusting his arm as the first-year starter with LSU that season. So he utilized the check down, utilized the safety net, and that's what Mason Taylor became, and it showed in a little bit of the numbers, like you said, the touchdown specifically. So he got to really get the ball in his hands and get acclimated to the SEC early. His first year was obviously one that started off a little bit sluggish and then continued to get ready for the SEC and handle business towards the back end of conference play. So becoming a safety net for Jaden Daniels was key. Carried that into years 2 and 3. Really, the evolution of his is something to monitor as well, because he started off as a really solid pass catcher, but started to develop even more by putting his hands in the dirt, becoming a more efficient blocker, and becoming a dynamic tight end. And I think that's what we got to see towards the end of year 1 and carrying that into year 2 as well.
Before we continue with year 2 and year 3, I do want to talk a little bit about what you just said with Mason Taylor's evolution as a blocker. Now, I wouldn't say that he's any kind of elite blocker just yet, but we've seen the growth there. And everybody seems to agree that there's more room for growth in the NFL. He could become an even better blocker. And this is one thing that Mason Taylor talked about after his freshman season. He said that one of the toughest transitions for him was really learning how to be a blocker on a play-in, play-out basis, because run blocking was one thing, but pass pro was a whole different challenge. He talked about wanting to emulate George Kittle. From a receiving standpoint, it was more Travis Kelce, but as an all-around tight end, he's talked a lot about George Kittle. Tell me about how he improved as a blocker over the 3 seasons at LSU.
Yeah, I think, Scott, first and foremost, it starts off in the weight room. He put on some size. And obviously he got to LSU kind of looking the part physically, but continuing to get continue to get stronger. I mean, that's the first and foremost piece, is to get stronger. And we saw that. And then you get more fundamentally sound. You get adjusted to the schemes. You get adjusted to kind of pulling out as well as dropping back in coverage, or not dropping back in coverage per se, but dropping back during pass plays to get in a pass pro slot. So for him, just becoming more fundamentally sound is what really paved the way for him to become a more diverse blocker and a more diverse tight end as well.
Zach, let's talk about his sophomore season. As you said, he became a bit of a security blanket for Jaden Daniels. In his second season, that was the season that Jaden Daniels was the Heisman Trophy winner. And LSU had a ridiculous offense because you had an emerging Mason Taylor, but you also had Brian Thomas Jr. and Malik Neighbors with Jaden Daniels at quarterback. It's really amazing to me that LSU ever lost a game with all those players on it. But still, Mason Taylor continues to develop here. His second season at LSU, he winds up with 36 catches for 348 yards and a touchdown. So his numbers are down, but I think part of that has got to be because Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas are there. When you have those two guys, there's only so many targets to go around. So tell me a little bit about what happened here. Sophomore season, Mason Taylor seemed to continue his steady rise through the ranks there at LSU. Even if his numbers weren't making a jump, he still was that steady security blanket in a year where Jaden Daniels jumped up to become the best player in the country, and Malik Neighbors was a top 10 pick, and Brian Thomas Jr. a first-round pick. So a lot going on with that offense at LSU.
Yeah, I think it's a given that his numbers wouldn't kind of necessarily stay or continue to blossom even more. I think when I look at Mason Taylor, I look at a guy who's Mr. Consistent. He's always going to kind of make the right play, and he's always going to put up efficient numbers, and we saw that during years 1 and year 2. He carried the momentum in there, and even though the numbers in the touchdown category don't jump off of the page, he was a security blanket for Jaden Daniels. And when defenders started to play kind of that bracket coverage up top to try to contain Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas, that's where Mason Taylor became an efficient weapon for Jaden. And you also saw him begin to be a more consistent blocker. So though the numbers don't necessarily jump off the page, his impact on the field was felt kind of every single snap. So when I look at Mason Taylor, yeah, the numbers don't jump off in the touchdown category, but getting them down the field, becoming a locker room presence, I think that's where he started to become a better player for this team as a leader, because the tight end room was his at that point. He knew that he was going to be the dude. So I think that's where year 2 Mason Taylor really started to evolve, was off the field, and then as well being a consistent piece on the field too.
And one thing he's talked about a lot is his ability to get first downs and to take third downs specifically and turn them into first downs. That's certainly something that he did a lot of the first 2 years with Jaden Daniels, and then as we're going to get into year number 3 with Garrett Nussmeier, right?
Yeah, I think Garrett Nussmeier and him had just tremendous rapport. I don't think I can say it enough. I think when Garrett Nussmeier was down in the dumps at times and wasn't necessarily trusting his arm, it kind of showed flashbacks of year 1 Jaden Daniels. And in a way, Mason Taylor went through some inconsistent quarterback play. When you look at Jaden Daniels year 1, it was a little bit of a struggle. Year 2, boom, clicked. Then you go back to a new starter in Garrett Nussmeier, struggled a little bit down the stretch, but utilized Mason Taylor as a security blanket. And I don't want to sit back and act like Mason Taylor is only a security blanket and only a Mr. Consistent guy. He can jump off the page when need be. His hands are soft as butter. I mean, I feel like sometimes he's got stickum on his hands because he catches almost everything that goes his way. He can get those 10 to 15-yard plays, those intermediate routes. And we saw that with Garrett Nussmeier. And that's why in year 3, I really started to fall in love with a guy like Mason Taylor. That rapport with Nussmeier was truly something to watch. It was a work of art, especially when Nussmeier wasn't trusting the deep ball because he was throwing some interceptions and really just throwing it into too tight of windows. And that's where Mason Taylor really began to evolve as a player, is by having Nussmeier and him kind of develop that chemistry.
The relationship between Nussmeier and Mason Taylor goes all the way back to Mason Taylor's freshman season. In fact, he talked about when what happened at Florida State happened, Garrett Nussmeier patted him on the back and said, "Welcome to college football, and more specifically, welcome to the SEC," pretty much telling him, get used to this. This is what it's going to be like.
Yeah, and no doubt. And I think that that's what makes it such a kind of a fun 2024 season, is that you saw a guy like Garrett Nussmeier wait his turn, and he was a leader off the field. But once he got on the field, there were times where he didn't skip a beat. Obviously, there were some struggles along the way. But to have a guy like Mason Taylor on the field there is so key. Their relationship off the field was extremely important. And they've talked about that time and time again, specifically Garrett. Really praising a guy like Mason Taylor, just saying how important it is to have him in the huddle. But you got to see that down the stretch in 2024 where their relationship kind of showed. I mean, the chemistry was there day in and day out.
Statistically, Mason Taylor had his best season as a junior, and this could have gone one of two ways, Zach, because all of a sudden Jaden Daniels is gone, and so you don't have him throwing you the ball anymore. You've got a new quarterback, so there could be a dip in production, but at the same time, you now have Nussmeier, who is a close friend of Mason Taylor, so there's a built-in chemistry, and you don't have Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas Jr. taking up so many targets. When it comes to Mason Taylor, how this went was in the positive direction. He had 55 catches, a career high by significant margin, a career high in yards, 546. He only had 2 touchdowns, but still a very productive season. And like you said, I think this is where people realize his change of direction, his soft hands, huge strengths, still some upside as a blocker, but very consistent. And when you look at what he did his 3 years at LSU, he's the only tight end in LSU history to have over 1,000 yards. He's the only tight end in LSU history to have over 100 receptions. Of course, I'm talking cumulatively, not in one season. He broke the record for single-season receptions with 55 at LSU. So he is, in a lot of ways, the most productive tight end that LSU has ever had, which is saying something because even though LSU hasn't exactly been a tight end factory, I suppose, that is still a major program that has won national championships.
It is, and Mason Taylor rewrote the record books during his time in Baton Rouge, and I think year 3 was one where he started to piece things together really quickly, and it was an offense, by the way, Scott, that was pretty unique is the best way that I could put it. It was pass heavy, and a lot of defenses kind of understood that it was predictable at times, and Mason Taylor still found ways to kind of peel off and get some chunk plays time and time again. It wasn't always explosive plays, but just to get chunk plays, and like you said a minute ago, turn third downs into first downs and continue to move the chains was something that Mason Taylor did pretty much every single game as a Tiger during year 3. So, yeah, the numbers, again, consistent. It's what Mason Taylor does. He's going to put up numbers. They might not be these gaudy numbers that kind of make your eyes pop, but they're going to be productive, and he's going to make plays for you time and time again. Like you said, scouts and decision makers started to understand that he had a little bit quicker feet than they might have seen before. His hands were a lot more consistent than others might have thought. So he continued to carve his way as a top 3, top 5 tight end in the country, and ultimately that panned out come the NFL draft.